the founder effect, where a small group of, or a large population, from a large population, small group of individuals disperses to a new place. And I mentioned that because of the small population, drift is much stronger in small populations. And in this case, even a deleterious allele for retinitis pigmentosa, which is an autosomal recessive that leads to blindness, even with drift, it can actually increase in frequency. And so these British colonists from 1814 on this little small island now have a very, very high incidence of this disease, even if it's deleterious. Okay. I've decided to make a YouTube of the last part of this lecture on forces of evolution and evolutionary change. And we ended, so next, let's talk about non-random mating. That's another force of evolution. It actually doesn't change allele frequencies, it changes genotype frequencies. You end up with, instead of random mating, in other words, any individual in a population is as likely to mate with any other individual of the opposite sex, it's a subset. So when we were talking about sexual selection, that's non-random mating. So in the elk, the big bull elk, who's the harem master, he's doing all the mating with the females and fathering all the offspring, and all the other males have hardly any fitness, if at all. So that's certainly non-random mating. And likewise, in terms of the mannequin that does the moonwalk that we looked at, that little video, the same thing, a male that's brightly colored, that does the display correctly, is going to be the one that gets to mate with a female and fertilize her eggs, versus other males that aren't as attractive as that male, or if they had been, they maybe hadn't actually survived because they couldn't afford those traits that made them vulnerable to predation. And then we also oftentimes have what's called non-random mating or mate choice. In other words, assortative mating, where like mates with like. Like this. Instead of disassortative mating, and this can lead to inbreeding. So what's the consequences of non-random mating? Well, there's a loss of genetic diversity. It also reduces the effective population size, can cause inbreeding, depression, and increased risk in a smaller population that's only mating within their own group of harmful recessive mutations, like in the founder effect. A good example of this was in Egypt during, for King Tut, who was a pharaoh. He was actually, his parents were actually brother and sister, so obviously mating with relatives. This is more likely to bring out recessive mutations where each individual has the same one because of inheriting it from their parents who were so closely related. And inbreeding depression can cause all kinds of problems. So mummy DNA revealed high inbreeding and apparent fitness loss in Egyptian pharaohs. King Tut had a club foot. He had some very bad bones in his feet, obviously mutation. He had a cleft palate. He was more susceptible to malaria and probably other kinds of infections. He fathered 2 fetuses, but they were stillborn. So there's indication that this inbreeding depression caused all kinds of genetic problems with him and with any offspring that he produced. The same thing happened in Europe in the royal families. So the royal families all over Europe interbred with each other. They were the ones that gave rise to the various kings and queens and princes and their royal aristocracy. Even in places where, let's say, you had the Holy Roman Emperor in Austria was a member of the Habsburg family. The same thing happened in Spain. There was another member of the Habsburg family. So this inbreeding, where instead of royal members breeding with common people, they ended up with a large number of recessive deleterious bad alleles or bad mutations like hemophilia, a lot of schizophrenia, all kinds of problems. So this is one of the things that can happen. Okay, so we're going to talk about gene flow now. And this is the third force of evolution that can lead to changes in allele frequencies. So, and it can be anything from migration. For example, right here we have herds of migrating antelope and wildebeest on the African savanna from one place to another. We have butterflies migrating, penguins migrating. We also have pollination or dispersal of gametes, like here, right? Also here, these are coral, and here as well, and then seed dispersal also. Okay, so anytime you have, here's migration, let's say a large population, and we've got individuals okay, 3 different genotypes. And you have some group, let's say this group, they take off, and there's a little island here, and they end up with 1, 2, 3, and none of the reds. And red equals A1, A1. Blue equals A2, A2. And then green equals A1, A2. Okay, so go on to here. So what can happen is movement alleles from one population to another. So here are two separate populations, population 1 and population 2. They're homozygous for A1A1 for population 1, homozygous for A2A2 in population 2. If there is migration between them, then both populations will now have homozygous A1A1 and homozygous A2A2, and if they interbreed, there will also be heterozygous individuals who are A1, A2. Okay, so same here, big A versus little a, we have, okay, so movement of alleles from one population to another, like mutation, it can introduce new alleles into a population from another population. Gene flow reduces the genetic differences, and if you carried this bit out, eventually both populations would look exactly the same in terms of the alleles that they have, because there's just gene flow connecting them together. And so the populations, it's called homogenize. They would become more similar to each other. Than different. Okay, so when you actually restrict gene flow, you can start the speciation process. So this is the Grand Canyon. If you've never been there, I suggest you do go there. It's amazing. At the top is the Coconino, about 200 million years old. At the bottom is Cambrian rock, and then in certain places there's actually an area where you go from about rock that's about 500 million years old to I think 1.7 billion years old. Okay, so you get all these different kinds of rock. And then 7 million years ago, the Colorado River formed and actually ate away and created the Grand Canyon. So it was much. Here we are with these squirrels. The Kaibab squirrel on the right, and I forget what's the name of it, the other one on the left. They used to be the same species. Back here, here's the Grand Canyon. Okay, so if we go before there was a Grand Canyon, there was a squirrel right here that lived all across this whole Kaibab Plateau. And then about 7 million years ago, there was a change in the geology. The Colorado River was diverted and started to cut across the plateau. And now you had on the left one plateau in the north, and on the other another plateau on the south. And the squirrel population was now divided as well. and there was no more gene flow between the squirrel population. And so, over time, the population started to diverge. Gene flow all across this plateau before the river came in. Gene flow has now been cut off. So now we have Colorado River, and on one side we have a squirrel species, the Kaibab Plateau species of squirrel, and on the other side we have A bears. So this is A bears, and this is the Kaibab. Bab squirrel. Okay, so where there was, and now we have a situation like this where these two different populations now are evolving differences, whether it's from genetic drift or different mutations or evolution by natural selection. They are now accumulating differences over time because they're reproductively isolated. There's something called horizontal gene transfer, where bacteria can transfer a genetic material, in other words, DNA, from one bacteria to another. And this can also be done by viruses picking up DNA. So viruses can actually carry DNA from one species, let's say from a cat. If it then infects a human, it can actually insert that cat DNA into humans. Okay. So, and that's the end of this. So a question, gene pools and size matter. In the face of environmental change, what is more likely to go extinct? A large gene pool with lots of different alleles, or a small gene pool with only a few alleles. So here's a couple of gene pools. Here's the whole gene pool, right? And then here are smaller gene pools. With only a subset of alleles. Well, a small gene pool. A small gene pool is more likely to go extinct because it doesn't have the variety of alleles, some of which might actually be adapted to that new environment. Why are they more likely to go extinct? There are few alleles than that natural selection can act on. Genetic drift has larger effect on small population. Both A and B are true. That's correct. Species are more likely to evolve rapidly by natural selection if they have a large population with a large gene pool. Do individuals evolve? No. They get Individuals were born with the alleles they have, like getting cards, they don't change. Does evolution require a will to adapt, like an organism thinking, oh, I better adapt? No. Organisms don't evolve by creating adaptations in response to changing conditions. Again, they inherited the traits and the alleles from their parents, and those don't change. It's only the populations that change over time. Is evolution progressive, or is it random? No. It's random. So it's true that in the fossil record we go from simple to more complex, but things had to start out simple. You could actually now there have things that organisms or lineages that have actually evolved to become more simple over time instead of more complex. There's no such thing as more highly evolved. Do organisms act for the good of the species? No. Individuals, in terms of evolution by natural selection, in terms of fitness, individuals is a selfish thing. You want to leave more of your alleles into future generations, into future populations than anybody else. Is evolution perfect? Or does selection always make species better adapted? Not always. Is evolution by natural selection perfect? No. Evolution can only affect change depending on what's there to begin with. And that's enough.